Welcome, my friends. Welcome, everyone, whether you're joining us for the first time or maybe you've been with me for other webinars before. You're very welcome. Thank you for being here today. Thank you also to the people who are watching this on recording. I regret, of course, that it's impossible to find the perfect time for everyone in the world to have these live webinars. So I apologize if you haven't been able to watch these webinars live, if you're in Asia or you're just at work or otherwise busy, then I'm sorry that you can't join us live, but thank you for watching the recording. And if you are watching this in many months' time, we are in September 2020 when we were doing this live webinar. So welcome, thank you for being with us today. This is the first session of Tasting Around the World, my sixth webinar series, which focuses on one variety in each session. And we'll look at some of the most important international grape varieties grown in some of the most important growing regions for those varieties. The impetus, I guess, for this whole series of webinars comes from my kind of ongoing interest, fascination by why wines taste as they do. Now, that might seem like a very obvious thing to say, but a lot of the times I think we're just interested, or we just talk about the fact that they do taste as they do. This one has got flavors of such and such. This one's got a full body, and we kind of like, oh, okay, and then we move on. What I really want to do, and what I've always been fascinated in my wine studies, is why it tastes like that, why it's got that size body weight. So I hope that in this series, we're going to be able to explore some of those factors by looking across different varieties at the same, in different places around the world. Okay, so please use the questions function if you have any questions, and otherwise we will move on. Michelle, I think everyone else can hear me perfectly fine. Everyone tell me if you can't hear me, but I think we're doing good. Michelle, maybe you've got me on mute, but tell me if anyone else has any problems, but I think we're otherwise okay. So we're going to start just by doing a little intro to what we're going to be talking about in this session. And in fact, we can use this slide that I just pulled up really for a kind of catch-all, a few thoughts that we can think about throughout all different 6 webinars, because we're going to be doing the same kind of appraisal, whatever the variety. Now, before I just talk through this slide, I should say a word about why I chose the varieties that I did. Clearly, to me, they had to have international resonance. If I love, for instance, the great Italian red wines, Nebbiolo or Sangiovese, but really they're not planted very much outside of those places in Italy. So then you think, well, I could have included things like Chenin Blanc or Merlot, varieties like that. And absolutely, those ones I could have done. But I just wanted to limit to those varieties which I think have got most importance in the international market and which can achieve the status of fine wine when grown in different places. So 3 whites, 3 reds. Of course, I could have extended this webinar, of course, but I wanted to keep it narrowly focused on those ones which I think both produce great wine and which are grown in numerous different regions worldwide. So that's just introduction to the whole series. So these are some of the questions that I want you guys to think about when we are tasting through the wines during the course of the next 6 weeks. The first is, obviously, we're going to look at one variety in each session. And so then the obvious thing is, as we go through the different regions where the variety is grown, how does it express itself in different places? How does the taste differ? How does the acidity or the tannin levels differ? Those kind of things. I think that's kind of the obvious thing. But then I really want you to think also about the second point here. Not just how the variety expresses the place, but how the place expresses itself, finds voice through the variety. The way that the variety can be a vehicle for the expression of place. We often hear that kind of language associated with very famous, often, dare I say it, French regions like Burgundy. People often talk about Chardonnay and Pinot Noir being vehicles for the expression of their place. But I think we can apply that more generally as well. So that's also something to think about. I think one of the really interesting things we might pick up on during the next 6 weeks, without even really realizing it, is doing little studies of the national characteristics of the countries that we're looking at, or the regional characteristics, or if we come back to the same region. So I think we just keep an ear to the ground to learn a little bit more about the countries and the regions, as well as about the varieties. I think that's the kind of interesting thing about the way we're going to do this. The third point I've written on here, I've said which aspects of the wine are region specific and which are country specific. What do I mean by that? Well, in today's session, we're just looking at 4 different countries. I didn't tell you go out and buy a Chablis or a Chassagne-Montrachet. I told you to go out and buy a French Chardonnay. So what we're all going to be doing when we're tasting the first wine in just a minute or two is we're all going to be tasting a French wine. And so it would be interesting to see whether we can find some things in common across the different examples of that variety across France. That would be what I would call country specific. So for instance, we might find out that French Chardonnays have a dry finish, right? They finish less on fruit and more on a kind of dry, chalky or saltiness, for instance. But that would be something that might be typical of France as a whole. But another question is, are there elements that are typical of the region? So if you have a Chablis, you might find a salty finish. But if you have a Chassagne-Montrachet, you might find a more stony finish, something like that. So we can make generalizations at 2 levels. The first of all, about the way that a whole country behaves, and the second about the way that individual regions within countries behave. Now, of course, I know I'm already pushing the boat out a little to do 4 wines in one session like we are going to do during this course. And I know that it costs you guys a lot of money to go out and buy 4 wines for each session if that's what you've done. But I couldn't think of another way of trying to really make a deep dive into these varieties without covering as many as 4 different regions. I think if you do fewer than that, you're leaving stuff on the table. I would have loved to have done more. You know, in today's session, we could have done Chablis and Meursault and Macon just in France, you know, and we'd still be missing things. So yes, of course, it's arbitrarily limited, but let's nonetheless try and think a little bit about both country style and regional style. The regional and country questions, to me, are questions, above all, when it comes to any wine over about $15 or 15 euros, are questions about climate. Again, this seems like a very, very obvious point. But what I'm trying to draw a contrast with is we often say things like, oh, well, Chablis, to use the same example, Chablis is kind of saline and chalky. And everyone says, oh, yes, well, I can identify and understand a Chablis when I find one because it's got those characteristics. Well, that's fine, but it doesn't tell us really anything about the climate in which it's grown. And why is that a mistake? Well, for me, I think that climate is the most important determinant of what a wine tastes like after variety. Clearly, the variety is going to influence the taste more than anything else. But after that, I think climate is going to have more of an influence. So Chablis, to stick with that example, is a cool climate wine, comes from northern France. And as such, it's got a lighter body and higher acid. And so that simple observation might tell us a little bit more about the wine than just remarking on one kind of flavor or aroma or some other characteristic of the wine. So it might seem very basic, but let's really think about climate as a focal point throughout this discussion about region and country. And then other considerations, like in the Chablis example, we might start thinking about soil types. That's always a classic for Chablis, or exposure, or altitude of the vineyards. Yes, all those are relevant. We can absolutely talk about those. We can also talk about winemaking styles. Some regions have got certain traditions of winemaking, particularly in Europe. Traditionally in Europe, some wines in Italy or Spain undergo very long aging in oak. That's just the tradition of those regions. So, we can talk about those factors as well. And then one thing I know we're going to touch on, at least in passing, is this sense that there are, in addition to those long-standing traditions or winemaking conventions in each region and country, there are also trends and fashions which might have been around for a little less time, but nonetheless, they're important in understanding why the variety tastes like it does when it comes from this place. So we'll talk about that a little bit as well. And then finally, I want to say right at the top, of course, that we're trying to do something very, very difficult here, which is to say, look, if you have a Chardonnay from France, it tastes a bit like this. And if you have one from Australia, it tastes a bit like that. Maybe the emphasis in that sentence should be on the a bit like, right? By which I mean, we can make our gestures towards trying to come to terms with what these styles are like. But to be overconfident would be a mistake. Because even within the same country, within the same region, there is so much variation in winemaking styles. So we have to paint with a necessarily broad brushstroke. So if your question is, well, why even try and do it at all in that case? My answer would be that if, like me, you believe in this thing we call terroir, that wines do taste of the place where they come from, at least ones over a certain price point, then if we're going to be really true to that, then we have to imagine that we can taste the difference between very different climates and different regions. So that's my justification for doing it at all. But I do want to qualify that, and let's just take it with a grain of salt. We have to be a little bit humble about what we can hope to achieve here. Okay, so that is the intro. So again, please do ask any questions about anything as we go along using the questions function, any comments or observations you have likewise. But what I'm going to do now is I'm going to ask you to, if you have one, to taste your French Chardonnay, to pour that and to take a look at that. And I'm going to move my slide on here. Okay. So these are Venkat, I'm going to come back to your question about climate in just a minute. Please remind me if I forget. It's a perfectly good question, but I just want to address it at a time where it will make a little more sense. So as you're pouring your wine, a few preliminary comments, I guess, about Chardonnay. The first is in France. It's kind of crazy to have one, opportunity to taste Chardonnay in France because, working from north to south, someone could have a Blanc de Blanc champagne tonight, and that would be fantastic. Or to Chablis, or to the Côte d'Or, or to the Mâconnais, Beaujolais Blanc. And then, of course, Chardonnay is grown elsewhere in France as well, in the Languedoc, in other places, perhaps not quite at the same price categories as those previous regions, but nonetheless. So you've got hundreds of miles of hundreds of kilometers of vineyards. So making very different styles. So it's kind of crazy to try and make any overall statements, but nonetheless, that's what we're going to try and do. Champagne, I think, is one we always forget. Champagne is such an important region, both for understanding what the potential of Chardonnay can be in France and, of course, in the international market as well. Okay, so what I'm going to try and do in each one of these slides when we're coming to a different region or a different country is I'm going to try and distinguish between the qualities which I think belong to the country and the qualities which you can find in the expressions of this variety in this country. So that's what I've done in the second part of this slide. But before we talk about that, I want you guys to taste what you have in the glass if you have a French Chardonnay. And then this is the question I want you to think about when you're doing that. What is the style of this wine? By that I mean, is it fruity? Is it rich and ripe? Or is it dry and chiseled? Is it full-bodied or light? Is it alcoholic or fresh? Is it oaky or brisk? Just try and tell me in the questions box both some answers to that question for your wine, and then please also tell me where your wine comes from. the answers won't mean too much to me if I don't know which wine you have. So please tell me what wine you're drinking and what the style of that wine is. I just want to see whether we can find any unifying factors across. I'm sure we have got lots of different regions represented. Okay. Okay, so while you guys are thinking about that, Venkat, I come back to your question. You ask, is climate something that could be clearly distinguished from harvest decisions? If I have a warm climate but pick early, wouldn't I end up with something similar to a cooler climate wine? Yes, you are exactly right, Venkat. But bear in mind the thing I said in the previous slide about we're also going to be looking at winemaking conventions and traditions. There are some winemaking regions where they do exactly what you described, albeit, for instance, they have a warm climate region and they pick very early. A classic example would be Hunter Valley Semillon. But if you know that that winemaking tradition exists, you can take that into your consideration and you can balance that. But we're going to be looking at how to understand those different winemaking styles across countries throughout this course. So good question. And I hope as we go on, we'll be able to answer that even better. Okay, so a few people have got some Burgundy, always a good bet. Some Bourgogne Blanc, some Pouligny Montrachet, Chablis. Let's see what you guys have got. So a Bourgogne Blanc is light oak, floral, dry, fresh. Good. Maria Chablis is dry, chiseled, mineral. Good. Another Chablis is savory, mineral, and just ripe. Probably a Merceau Charme, I assume that is Abigail. And then we got another Haute Côte, so another Bourgogne Blanc, medium-bodied, high alcohol with a crisp finish. Very good. Kirsten's wine is Saint Veron, and it's structured, spicy, high acid, moderate alcohol, firm acidity for a Burgundy. Broad and structured, but reserved on the fruit. Interesting for a Beaune White from Alice. A Macon, a couple of Macons here with high acidity, stone fruit, and a mineral finish. Very good. So I think we're beginning to come to these two bullet points to the left at the bottom of the slide here. I do find it helpful in my own tasting to have a kind of shorthand for what I think are national characteristics for different countries in terms of their wine styles. I mean, to give you an example that we're not going to be talking about this week, we can use, say, Italian reds. Italian reds generally have high to very high acidity for a red wine, and they have grainy, sandy, often slightly rugged or rustic tannins. Now, even that shorthand, while being very broad brushstroke, nonetheless helps us to frame the context. If you have a very silky, elegant wine, you might think twice before ascribing it to Italy when you have that in mind. So that's my reason for trying to come up with a shorthand for all of France, which I know is a crazy thing to do, but I'm arguing here for all of France, whatever the variety, whatever the region, what you're looking out for is balance. So that means there's no components that stick out too much, the alcohol or the acid or the tannin. Everything is kind of in balance. Dryness, this overall sense of dryness. What does dryness mean in this way? I mean that these wines are very rarely always about fruit. So the opposite of dryness would be fruitiness to me. So of course there is fruit in French wines and plenty of it, but that's not so much the focal point. And in particular, French wines to me always finish dry, however warm the climate, even from Châteauneuf-du-Pape in the south, in a very warm Mediterranean climate, they finish dry. So they're always fresh and they always want you to have another glass. I think that's such a stereotype of French winemaking. Firm structure, so structure in red wine being tannin, in our case today, of course, acid structure. And a few of you have noticed in the Chardonnays that you have that it's got a firm structure. So I think you're probably referring to the acid structure there. What that means is there's always a sense of architecture in the mouth of French wines. They're not collapsing in on themselves. They're not flabby. And moderate alcohols. Yeah, I know, of course, in the example I just mentioned, Chardonnay du Pape, you can get 15%. But in general, in France, you're getting alcohols which are commensurate with the body. They don't stick out, and often from most regions north of the Mediterranean, they're quite moderate and drinkable. So those are overall French qualities. And then you can see that I've tried to define these more narrowly for Chardonnay. I've tried to draw these out a little bit and make them more applicable just to Chardonnay. And of course, like I said, when you're dealing with everything from Champagne to Mâconnais, it's a kind of a difficult task. But nonetheless, these are some of the kind of factors I'm looking for in French Chardonnay. Precision. Precision means there's detail in the wine, that you can taste every little flavor here, 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 here. You can feel the detail, the subtlety. It's not just like a wave that overcomes your palate. It's detailed, there's precise flavors. Minerality, very difficult, vague word, I know, but of course we're looking for something chalky, saline, rocky, stony. There's something more than just fruit and oak in French Chardonnay. Moderate fruit concentration. Moderate fruit concentration is important to me when we compare to some of the wines we might be having later in this session. Chardonnay from warmer climates than France can be very rich and ripe. But even in the warmer regions of France, the mid-palate fruit on the tongue where you really tend to feel fruit in any wine, in French Chardonnay is never heavy or ponderous. So yes, it's concentrated, but it's never too dense or too overpowering. And the transparency to origin, yes, well, this is the difference between a Chablis and a Marceau and a Pouligny-Montrachet and a Mâcon. And probably we can't go into that too much. But clearly, if you're a French winemaker, you believe very strongly that your Chardonnay is a good expression of the place from which it comes. Now, you guys tell me, do those kind of descriptions, are they meaningful to you? Do they make any sense? Is there anything you would subtract from them, anything you would add to them, especially with regard to the wines you're tasting right now? Excuse me. Michelle says, I've tasted a couple of Chablis from 2018 that have not had the acid I would expect. I understand it was a warm year, exactly. So that's why you'd expect a little bit more reduced acid than perhaps normal in Chablis. Although what normal is in Chablis anymore, who knows, because every year seems to be a warm year. In this case, would you expect malolactic fermentation to be avoided? Not necessarily. Not necessarily. It just means the perception of the amount of change that malo has on the taste of the wine would be reduced. That's all. Okay, any other comments here? Neil, thank you. Okay, TJ. So TJ's making a comment here. TJ says, the wine wears its fruit and alcohol in a much different way than a similar New World example would have. So just to draw out TJ's comment a little bit, and TJ, tell me if this is not what you're getting at, but if you analytically had the same wine, say you had a Chardonnay with, 6 to 9 months oak, it was 13% alcohol, it was fermented completely dry, and then it was bottled. If you have one from California and you have one from Bourgogne Blanc, then somehow it just feels very different. And I think that's what you're getting at, TJ. And to me, that goes to the heart, perhaps especially of the first of the 2 bullet points I've written here about France. There's something about the overall balance of that French wines just seem naturally to give, where nothing seems forced. They seem to be in harmony with themselves. They're very elegant somehow. Of course, if you have bad winemaking, that screws up everything. But in general, nothing seems to be layered on. It just seems to kind of emerge naturally. I'm flattering French winemakers when I do that, which is never a good idea. They don't need any more flattery than they already get. But TJ's saying a New World example might seem out of balance. I mean, of course, I hope we're about to taste many New World examples that are not at all out of balance. But sometimes you do get occasions when, from warmer climate regions, the fruit can seem to dominate the acidity a little bit, or the alcohol might stick out. The balance in French wines is something that I really think about a lot, and I think it's what makes them so drinkable, by the way. Okay, good. So any final comments about these, about this French Chardonnay? Any questions about Chardonnay in France? I know it's ridiculous to talk about it in just 20 minutes, but I do want to keep moving so we can taste some comparable examples. And Kirsten says the structure of French Chardonnay perhaps lends itself to aging more than a wine from the New World. Well, I think a few New World winemakers might argue with that, but I do think that the firm structure, the acid structure, as someone said, people who know me well, the linear acidity of Chardonnay, just really directional, it's really going somewhere. I think that's a hallmark of French Chardonnay, and I do think that probably helps the aging for sure. Jessica's saying she's got a savory tasting Bourgogne Blanc, and I do think that's another aspect, that Chardonnay, being a variety that can tip so easily into being sweet tasting or tropical or even candied. There's still a dry, savory wine from France, which I love. I mean, sentimentally speaking from my own part, I was brought up in the UK and we drank European wines, that's what we drank. And, you know, French wines, especially being in England so close to France. And to me, wine was dry wine. That's what wine was. And then I came to live in the States and I realized that a lot of wine could be really pretty sweet tasting, which is what we're going to talk about in a little bit from the USA perhaps. And that's a very obvious point. But the first thing I always talk to people, you know, beginners groups about is I say, look, European wine, you're looking for dryness in the wines, not in terms of the residual sugar levels, but in terms of the overall effect. The fruit is not sweet tasting and often finishes pretty dry. I think that's really fundamental. Okay, so I think that will do it for French Chardonnay. I mean, that really is hard to do things in isolation, so it will actually help us to move on to the other countries, and then we can go back and compare. I think that'll be pretty useful. So let's go on to the next one, which is a New Zealand Chardonnay. And I guess the first question which I want to ask you guys is, did you have any issues finding a New Zealand Chardonnay? Was that something that you were able to do? Certainly, I'm down here in Florida, and it was quite difficult for me to find a New Zealand Chardonnay. But fortunately, I did through the help of my good friend Alessandra. Thank you for the wine, Alessandra. Now, tell me, you guys, what you are drinking. What producer, perhaps? Yeah, Tufi, you see, is in Brazil. Tufi's saying it's pretty tough to get New Zealand Chardonnay in Brazil, and I can believe it. I think the reason I want to put this in, the New Zealand Chardonnay, in this presentation, even though it's quite hard to find, is just because I think these are some of the best Chardonnays anywhere in the world. But I just wish they would be better distributed. I don't know whether that's because volume, there's just not that much produced compared to Sauvignon Blanc. Well, we know that for sure. Or whether distributors around the world just want to focus on Sauvignon Blanc. But either way, I think it's regrettable because I think these wines from New Zealand are wonderful. So Rodolfo's got Kumu River, great wine. Michelle's got a Hawke's Bay. Someone's got a Marlborough, another Hawke's Bay, and two more Kumus. Anthony's got Craggy Range, excellent. Kumu River. Good in Washington, Luciano is very good, easy to find. Okay, excellent. So it seems like some people nonetheless were able to find it, which is very good. Okay, so yes, like I said, hard to find, but worth it. Regions across the country, perhaps a little bit more, well, really both in the South and in the North Islands. So let's talk a little bit about what we can expect from New Zealand. I mean, one way of doing this is to think about, not about New Zealand Chardonnay, which might not be so familiar to all of us, but to think about New Zealand Sauvignon Blanc, which I'm sure we are all very familiar with. And if you think about New Zealand Sauvignon Blanc, look at the New Zealand qualities I've written here, and just imagine I'm just talking about New Zealand Sauvignon Blanc. Fruit primacy. What do I mean by that? An abundant, clear fruitiness, both on the nose and on the palate. It almost overflows with that fruitiness. It's very obvious that is absolutely the focal point of the aromatics and of the flavors on the palate. Fruit purity. We do not want to obscure the primacy of that fruit by using heavy-handed new oak or really anything else, not by blending, not by extended aging, nothing which is going to obscure the purity of that fruit. The purity of the fruit is really the #1 goal. Again, think about New Zealand Sauvignon Blanc, how clear that fruit sounds. Moderate alcohol and body. Sauvignon Blanc, 12.5%, 13% alcohol, light to medium bodied at most. Yes, there are some exceptions in oak, but they're rare. Fresh acidity, I mean, it almost goes without saying in those examples of the Sauvignon Blanc, just at least moderate, usually high acidity. And restrained use of oak, again, in most of those examples, just stainless steel to retain the first 2 points, the fruit primacy and the fruit purity. So I hope if you just think about New Zealand Sauvignon Blanc, you'll understand what I mean by New Zealand qualities. But my broader argument is that you can apply those same qualities to all New Zealand styles, all varieties, white and red. Excuse me. Now, of course, you are going to have oaked red wines and some oaked whites, like we're going to experience in just a second. That's obvious. But nonetheless, the oak is very rarely 100% new French barriques or anything like that. And one of the reasons I think for that is because it comes back to climate, really. What we're talking about in New Zealand is a really quite cool climate for a non-European wine producing region. And that means that you really want to rein in on the oak because the flavors are a bit more delicate than you're going to find in a warmer climate place. And if you want to preserve that delicacy, you don't drown those flavors in oak. Anything else I should say? Yeah, even in the red wines, the acidity, for instance, if you get a Syrah from Hawke's Bay or Cabernet, Merlot, Bordeaux blends from the same region, and certainly the Pinot Noirs, again, the acidity is a great feature of those wines. It's really, really nice. Okay, so with that being said, that's the kind of context I think we're working in for New Zealand wines in general, which is, for me, a happy context. I love all those qualities, so that's great. Why don't we taste the New Zealand Chardonnay, and you tell me whether those qualities appear in your wine, or if you get something different, then you tell me. Corinne, I can see your questions perfectly fine. Yes, you're in the right place. Okay, Stanislav's saying, yes, it feels like a cooler climate with some minerality and clean fruit. So when I'm talking about fruit purity, you're describing, I think, as clean fruit, which I agree. Yvonne, I agree that these characteristics could be extended to New Zealand Pinot Noir, like I was doing for Sauvignon Blanc, but you could equally well extend them to New Zealand Pinot Noir. Does Central Otago deviate from the style? Well, maybe we should talk about that when we do Pinot Noir. If I can defer your question for about 3 or 4 weeks, Shengli, I hope you don't mind. We can talk about that perhaps a bit better with Pinot Noir. I do think that in general, Central Otago can produce some of the most concentrated wines of any region, usually concentrated Pinot Noir. But they've still got this resounding, it's like sounding a bell, the clarity of the fruit that comes from those wines from Central Otago. So I would argue that they are, albeit in slightly more muscular mode, nonetheless typical examples of the kind of thing I'm describing. Okay, so what else are you guys getting in your Chardonnays here? Corey is getting some matchstick reduction. So we'll talk about that in just a second. Let's see, TJ is getting some flintiness on the nose, wondering whether that's reduction, clean and crisp, even at 14%. A really interesting point. So I'm going to come back to both of those points, reduction and clean and crisp, even at 14%. And that could easily be confused with Burgundy. So Tufi says the same thing. Okay, so let's address head on this point about reduction. Reduction is when a wine has been without the presence of oxygen, either or both during the aging of the wine in the cellar or just in bottle. So if you have an environment without oxygen, it can create these struck match flinty aromas, which for people who haven't found them in wine before can be very strange and unexpected. But in fact, they're quite common in certain styles, especially of white wine. In red wine, you do find reduction a little bit. Perhaps my most reduced red wine I consistently find is Syrah, but there are others as well. But in white wine, it's much more common. I find it particularly common in wines under screw cap. There's complex science about all that, as you guys know. But I do think that a hallmark of New Zealand, we're not going to mention Austria right now, because Austria, which bottles so much of its wine under screw cap, can feature quite a lot of reduction as well. But these New Zealand, being such a strong proponent of screw cap, can often feature a lot of reduction. So you get sometimes a Sauvignon Blanc, although it's not really good news if you do find it in Sauvignon Blanc, because you don't want to do anything to repress or suppress those aromas. That's the whole glory of Sauvignon Blanc. So if the glorious, generous, fruity bouquet of Sauvignon Blanc from New Zealand is obscured by this struck match sulfurous flinty thing, then it's not good news. But by contrast, Chardonnay is not an aromatic variety. It's not a neutral variety, but it's not an aromatic variety. It's somewhere in the middle. And so then the question is, does this kind of flintiness from reduction, which I certainly get in my glass here, which by the way is under cork, not under screw cap, does that add or detract from the harmony, the beauty, and the complexity of the wine? Is it necessary? It is a winemaker's choice. It can be managed. So I do think that, it doesn't have to be there, but it is a way of ensuring freshness in the wines as well. And so what do you guys think? Are you happy with the amount of reduction in your wine, the flintiness, the struck match, or is it getting in the way of what you perceive to be the real wine, the generous fruitiness that is the essence of Chardonnay? Oops, going forward. Let's just see your comments here. Okay, so Neil says he does like a bit of a matchstick complexity. And Corinne says, if your wine is oaked, if you have a little bit of oak in your wine, of course it depends what wine you have, then it can sort of blend in quite naturally with the oak notes, so it's not too obtrusive. And Jessica says, one good aspect, this is a great point from Jessica, is that the flintiness, the reduction, can balance out the fruit. So if it sort of tempers the fruit, if the fruit is getting a bit too much or too ripe or too tropical, then that's the other side of the seesaw. It kind of balances it. I like that point. Some people are not finding any reduction at all, which is fine. If you've got pure fruit, that's great. The reason why I'm just going on about this a little bit is that I do find it quite a feature of New Zealand. A lot of people are comparing their wine to Burgundy. I think that's very normal. And of course, Burgundy often features some reduction as well. So the question is, how would you distinguish if someone just gave you a glass of one or the other? How would you distinguish between them? Really, what I point to is on the New Zealand qualities bullet points, the first two categories, the fruit primacy and the fruit purity. I know we're talking very fine gradations here, but in Burgundy generally, I'm looking for something beyond just fruit and beyond just reduction. I mean, some form of minerality or dryness, which is so, or should be perhaps so symptomatic of that premium region. Whereas I still think here, even though my wine is quite reduced, there is a kind of core of very pure fruit just under the reduction. It can be quite hard to discern. I think on the nose, often there's a big confusion when you have the reduced examples of New Zealand Chardonnay. But just try on the palate and see whether that, because sometimes you think, oh, that reduction might be minerality. See whether that continues on the palate or whether it becomes more about the fruit on the palate. If it becomes more about being purely fruited on the palate, then I'm thinking, oh, we might be from a New World origin with more focus on the fruit purity. Yeah. To me, my wine, it kind of smells like Burgundy, but it doesn't really taste like it. And I think that's often an effect of reduction. It smells like it's going to be quite a taut and tight wine, but in fact, it's a bit more rounded than you expect. So there's a kind of disjuncture between the nose and the palate. No, that is not a hallmark of New Zealand. It's just my particular wine. In examples like Kumeru River, which may be the sort of premium producer of Chardonnay in New Zealand, you get, I think, a much better balance. But to me, the ultimate question about this difficulty between identifying Burgundy and New Zealand is about that fruit purity underneath it all. I don't think Burgundy is ever really quite that pure, because basically Burgundy doesn't really want to make fruity wines. That's not the point of Burgundy. Okay, well, let's see what you guys are saying. So Kirsten's saying quite tropical flavors in her wine with the struck match. It should be more of a food wine. The struck match does balance the tropical fruit, like you were saying, Jessica. So there's a kind of balance between the reduction and the fruit. Yes, Tufi's saying he doesn't have any reduction in his, but it has been under cork or Coravin. Now you see Alice is making the contrasting argument. Alice is saying, I see it in so many New Zealand Chardonnays, the reduction. I find it a bit repetitive. It's a bit one-dimensional. If you like the smell of reduction, great, but all reduction smells the same. I mean, that's kind of the argument, right? But then take, for instance, a very top white Burgundy producer like Coche Jury. These wines are $1,000 a bottle or more. Now, those wines are not as reductive as they used to be. But there almost used to be this complaint that once you'd had one Coche Jury, you'd had them all because of this effect, right? It's almost as if we're like a little bit ashamed about the fruit and we have to kind of cover it up. Whereas I think the whole glory about New Zealand is the wonderful purity and precision of that fruit. And I think the other thing is at the bottom of the slide here, I've written New Zealand Chardonnay qualities. The first one I've written is hint of minerality. Now, I think this is something which can often be confused with the reduction, which might be another argument against the reduction. If you have got a nice, perhaps dryness at the heart of the wine, some kind of dry form of minerality, dustiness perhaps, or stoniness, then why would you want to cover that up? A very consistent mistake that people make in tasting it is by saying that the reduction is minerality. It's not, it's just reduction. I always, not always, but I often think that winemakers sometimes don't have the confidence in their own materials. What's underlying the winemaking is great stuff. So stop obscuring it. But I don't really have strong opinions one way or the other about the reduction. But I would say that if you do find a reduced wine with very great fruit clarity and it's a Chardonnay, then New Zealand might be a good option, because I do think it's a style which is common in New Zealand. Yeah, exactly, Stanislavs, that reduction is also a kind of preservative of the freshness of the fruit. Luciana says her wine's like half a Burgundy. Yes. Does reduction lessen as the wine opens up? I think it does. I mean, naturally, you would think it would do as it comes into contact with the oxygen, which it has been lacking. And then, like you were saying, TJ, then the minerality which is underneath can come to the fore. Reduction fades, but minerality stays the same if it's really there. So if you really want to find out whether your wine has got some minerality underneath the reduction, you just have to wait in the glass for a little bit. Yep, Tufi, I definitely think you could aerate the wine to bring out the natural aromas. Okay, so Michelle is making a point about New Zealand doesn't finish on acid as Burgundy does. Well, I know what you're getting at, Michelle. I think I'd phrase it a little differently. I would say that not so much the Burgundy finishes on acid as that it finishes on dryness. Whereas I think New Zealand, as you're hinting, I think, finishes on fruit. I mean, does anyone's wine here not finish on fruit? Mine certainly does. And again, to me, this is such an important distinction between European wines and non-European wines, that non-European wines almost always finish on fruit from whatever country. And we're going to see a couple more examples of this, even just in this session. I'm not saying one's right and one's wrong. It's just a difference in the climates, I believe. Okay, would New Zealand, and Catherine, yeah, would New Zealand have a sweeter finish than Chardonnay from Burgundy? Broadly speaking, I think. I think yes, but not sweet as in cloying. I think I'd rather say more fruity finish, not sweeter, more fruity. TJ is asking, are you saying reduction obscures terroir? I'm saying it can obscure terroir, but if you're of the school of thought that aging wines reductively helps preserve the fruit, it would have the opposite effect, right? Because it would keep everything super fresh. So whatever's there could be the more easily perceived under the reduction. So it's a kind of paradox. It goes both ways. But I think when a wine's young, it's very hard to really see the substance of the thing if you can't get beyond the reduction. But as the reduction fades out, then the real thing emerges a little bit, and hopefully the terroir with it. How much does the vintage influence the qualities of a specific country? Well, I think in general terms, we're going to move on in a minute because I know we're running a little behind, but in general terms, vintage variation is just as important in countries outside Europe as it is within Europe. And especially, I would say, important in cooler climate regions like New Zealand. I think vintage variation is hugely important. New Zealand has had a couple of tough vintages recently. It can just be either very cold a harvest with the risk of frost, or it can just be wet. You know, we're dealing with a Pacific climate, which is just risks always being very, very wet, with the attendant effects on the quality of the crop. So sure, I think it has a very big influence. Venkat, is the reduction intentional or is it a fault? Well, that's the $1 million question. So what I'm arguing is I think that winemakers can control, at least to quite a large extent, how much reduction their wine ultimately ends up having, at least when it's young. So I do think it's largely a choice, but some of you have said you enjoy it, some of you have said you don't enjoy it. And the margin of what constitutes a fault lies somewhere between those two. Does it add complexity, or does it obscure what the wine really is? There's no hard and fast rules. That's really something which is for you. But certainly, if reduction goes too far, and when that happens, the wine smells like blocked drains or rotting eggs, then clearly that's a fault. But how far is too far is up to you. Okay. So Chardonnay New Zealand, summing up, you're looking for fruit purity, restrained everything, restrained body, restrained alcohol, fruit primacy, fruit purity, and then sometimes some playing around with reduction in the wine. Okay, so I think it's going to be super interesting for us to compare now actually to the next wine, which is going to be Australia. So why don't we go and find our Australian wine. Here we go. I'm just going to pour mine. My example of Australian Chardonnay comes from Margaret River, which is great for me because I love Margaret River wines, both white and red. Where do your Australian examples come from, guys? Please tell me. I'd love to know. Funny enough, so my Australian Chardonnay is under screw cap, but my New Zealand one was under cork, which is the opposite way around than you would normally guess, I think, for those two countries. Okay. Toothy, long lees contact clearly is antioxidative, but I'm not sure that's the same thing as reduction. I'm not sure that's the source of all reduction, but it was certainly something which would contribute to an anaerobic environment. Rodolfo, I have the same wine as you. How about that? Toothy's got the Vas Felix, which is another fantastic producer from Margaret River, if you guys don't know them. Oh, Tasmanian example for Anthony, which is fantastic. I love that. Corey's got Bindi. Some of you guys might not know Bindi, but Bindi is a cult Chardonnay, and I think Pinot Noir producer from Victoria, and wonderful wines. A great guy as well. Yarra Valley, Goulburn, excellent. Giant Steps, I love Giant Steps. Just got sold actually to Jackson Family Wines, as you know. Lovely winemaker there as well, Steve. Great, always great wines. Margaret River, Adelaide Hills, excellent. Fowls, yes, that's a nice wine. Another Bindi. Oh, you're lucky, TJ. I wish I had Bindi. Excellent. Okay, so good diversity. This is going to be super interesting because we can compare Adelaide Hills, Tasmania, Yarra, and Margaret River. So super cool. Okay, so main regions, you can see them listed here. I'm going to be a little conservative about how far we can make regional statements. This is exactly what this region tastes like, because once again, there's a lot of variation in wine producing styles across Australia. So, but in very hesitant means, I think we can at least try it. So my overall statement here is ripe, but far more restrained than California. You might be like, okay, but why California? Why not talk about New Zealand or Burgundy? I think to me, the Australian climate, broadly speaking, which is ridiculous in such a huge country, can be a bit closer to the warmer style of California than to the cooler style of New Zealand or of France. And of New Zealand or California, I'm choosing California just because I think there's something about the intensity of the sun and the warmth produces wines of a similar style. I think we are getting a bit further away here from the French style, although some of you from Tasmania and perhaps from Adelaide Hills might argue with me on that. But let's just look at the comparison here. So the Australia qualities sound quite similar to what we just experienced in New Zealand. Fruit led. Remember I said fruit primacy before. I think it's really the same thing, fruit primacy, fruit led. What I mean is that fruit comes first in the wine, not any kind of oak or stoniness or anything else. Just fruit always leads the way in Australian wines. Red, white, sparkling. Fruit is the goal, I think, of a lot of Australian wines as a vehicle for expressing their place or their variety. Fruit is what you're going to use to do that. Again, you're looking for purity of fruit. What does that mean in this context? So we saw, I think you'll understand what I meant by the purity of the fruit in the New Zealand example you just tasted. And you might say to me, well, I mean, don't all countries outside Europe have purity of fruit? Well, I'd argue that maybe they don't in the same way as New Zealand and Australia. So for instance, South Africa or Chile or Argentina, perhaps they don't have quite the clarity and precision and that kind of resounding bell of clarity of fruit that we get from New Zealand, and I'm arguing now from Australia as well. Australia, I think there's a real emphasis on how pure and clear that fruit expresses itself. And then I've just finally put here ripe but balanced. Notice I didn't say the word ripe when we were talking about New Zealand, not because the wines are unripe, but just because the fruit is always kind of moderate. Remember, I was talking about moderate everything, moderate body, moderate alcohol. In the same category for New Zealand would be moderate fruit ripeness. It's certainly ripe, but it's not overripe or overgenerous. But here I do think in general, Australian fruit is riper, but it always remains balanced. Balanced by the acidity, especially, and other elements in the wine, hopefully by any oak use also. But that's what we're about to find out. Okay, so let's taste the Australian Chardonnay. So Stanislaus is saying that his wine is solar, as in sunny, and ripe, and it seems higher in alcohol. I think you mean it seems higher in alcohol than the New Zealand wine. Sure. Medium body, no signs of oak. Okay. Catherine's asking, is the way to differentiate between New Zealand and Australia the level of ripeness? I think that is probably the first one I would go to, yes. we'll talk in a minute. You can see the bullet point about Australia's Chardonnay qualities. We can talk about those as well, Catherine. But if I was going to go with one thing, I would say that in general terms, the country of Australia produces generally riper wines than the country of New Zealand. So that's a great place to start. Corey says that his wine has got a touch of matchstick reduction, beautiful ripe fruit, and decent acidity. I think that's a really nice description. So Corey's talking about the fact that the fruit is ripe, but he says beautiful, which means to me like it's very enjoyable. And the acidity, look what Corey says. He says the acidity is decent. So remember when we were talking about the firmly structured French Chardonnays, and we noted there's quite a lot of acidity also in the New Zealand examples. But Corey here is saying the acidity is decent. So it means it's there, it's noticeable, it's appreciable, but perhaps it's not so prominent as a feature in the wine as maybe in those two other places. Okay. So Anthony's got the Tasmanian example. He says he's surprised how ripe it is, but it's still pure and it's not excessive. And he's saying that he might have thought that Tasmania would be more restrained than his example, but it does have some bottle age. It's 2014. Sometimes I think Chardonnay can seem to put on weight or even add fruit with age. It's weird, the effect that it has in bottles sometimes. So that could be the effect you're talking about. But generally speaking, pure and ripe for Anthony. Michelle says rounder and riper also with lower acidity than New Zealand, which I think is what Corey was saying as well. Jessica's saying Burgundian winemaking applied to very ripe fruit. So Jessica, you can explain if I'm going wrong here, but by Burgundian winemaking, I assume that you're talking about perhaps some careful use of oak, maybe even some new oak, perhaps a little bit of reduction, maybe some use of lees to add a bit of additional texture to the wine, but overlaying riper fruit than you would get in Burgundy. That surely makes sense to me. So TJ is saying that his wine doesn't have any noticeable oak. Good. Okay, so let's just look at this bottom bullet point on my slide here. So again, I'm making the point very clearly that there are a lot of regional variations in style. If you're like me in Margaret River, I do find those wines can be quite not excessively ripe or heavy or anything like that, but just ripe. The fruit is juicy, you can sink your teeth into it, and it's enjoyable, and there's a lot of pleasure in how ripe the fruit is, but it's not over the top. And I'm adding something which is very important. There's still a good sense of acid direction. When I write streamlined, this goes back to my point about the horizontal directional acidity of Chardonnay always going somewhere. I often find that Margaret River wines, in spite of the ripe fruit, or even the ripe fruit, is balanced out by that kind of directional, linear, horizontal acidity. And then importantly in Margaret River, I also find them quite dry on the finish, even in spite of the fact of the generous fruitiness. But elsewhere, I'm talking about you guys who've got the Adelaide Hills, who've got the Yarra Valley and the Tasmania, I'm saying can be only medium bodied. Of course, you can harvest later and make the wine riper and have a fuller bodied. But is your example medium bodied, or would you say it's full bodied? Because there are some examples, for instance, a classic of its type is the Shaw and Smith M3 Chardonnay, which is quite Burgundian in only being medium bodied, being very taut, being very tense, and having a really strong sense of direction. So to me, that would be the kind of leaner expression of Australian Chardonnay compared to the riper expression from Margaret River. But of course, again, within each region, there are many exceptions. And then I'm arguing there's some reduction. I think someone said they found a little bit of reduction, some minerality. And like I think we pretty much all agree, we're riper here than New Zealand. But I'm interested to hear from the Adelaide and Yarra Valley people what you find. Kirsten's wine is a bit more generous than some of the more restrained examples that have been coming out of Australia. Ripe fruit, but more traditional Australian style. So a riper, perhaps, example there. Okay, so Yvonne's asking, what about the leaner, skinnier styles becoming more prevalent across many Australian regions? Well, actually, Yvonne, I would argue the opposite. I think we've come through that phase of trying to make Chablis in Australia. I think that was maybe about 10 years ago that really hit its peak. And now we're coming back into a world where, if you see my description here of medium-bodied and taut, I think that's what more winemakers are going for now, who were previously trying to do the very light, very acid-driven examples. I think they kind of felt that maybe they went a bit too far there, and they're now going for something a little bit in the middle, a bit more fruit, but still taut and restrained. So Vidya is saying from Victoria, riper, fuller bodied than New Zealand wine, riper fruit. The ripeness is about the same as a Macon, but really interesting point from Vidya, the body is fuller than a Macon. Yeah. Remember I was talking earlier about if analytically you had the same, technical details, same alcohol, etc. Nonetheless, wines from Australia or California or elsewhere outside Europe, they have a different feel. And I think that this is the kind of the thing that Vidya is getting at. The fruit is a similar ripeness level to Macon, but the body is fuller and weightier. Okay, Abigail says Yarra Valley has got ripe fruit but alcohol at the ends. So maybe the alcohol is just sticking out a little bit on Abigail's wine. Neil saying ripe with moderate but not that firm acidity, maybe not as firm as in the Burgundian or the New Zealand examples, Neil. And he says the label says 12% alcohol, but he doesn't believe it, which 12% would be, I think, quite low for Australia for sure. Jessica, yeah, Lee's, so a bit of texture. So Vidya has also got some reduction. Okay, Tufi has got the Vas Felix from Margaret River, and he remarks that it's got great balance, like a French style, and great elegance, with excellent use of new oak, very high quality. And I'm really glad that you said that, Tufi, because not just because Vas Felix to me is one of the great producers of Chardonnay in Australia and really anywhere in the world, but to remind us about how good these Chardonnays from Australia can be at their best. And I think that Vas Felix really is one of the best, which is to say this combination of ripe fruit, sophisticated use and integration of new oak, the preservation of that line of acidity. And I wonder too, whether you also get a little bit of dry stoniness as well. I just think that these wines from Margaret River can be some of the most complete Chardonnays anywhere in the world. Anthony notes that his Tasmanian Chardonnay's got good acidity, absolutely. Rodolfo's got New World ripeness, but with reduction as well. Interesting. Fleur says the Yarra Valley crisp acidity with smoky oak character but bright fruit. Yeah, you see, this is I think the thing that Australia can do quite well, to have the brightness and the generosity of fruit while retaining the acidity as well. And here's another person saying that the alcohol feels like it's higher than what it says on the label. Good. Abigail thinks that her Yarra Valley is restrained, whereas TJ is confusing his wine for a Sonoma. So maybe that indicates that it's a bit riper than some of these descriptions. Okay, so for Corin, the New Zealand and the Australia have oak, but the Australian example, which comes from Adelaide Hills, is actually leaner than the New Zealand example. I think if there was one region in Australia which was going to produce examples of similar body weights to New Zealand, it would probably be Adelaide Hills, which can produce quite cool climate expressions, I think. Good. Okay, so I think we're almost done with Australia Chardonnay. Again, please tell me if you think any of my overall kind of summing up comments in these two bottom bullet points are incorrect, or I should add anything to them. But I don't think we're going too far wrong with these descriptions. This combination, I think, of certainly ripe fruit in Australia while always retaining the balance of the acidity. And if there is any oak use, hopefully it's quite judicious, it's quite sensible, and it's well integrated into that ripe fruit. Okay, so now we're going to change pace a little bit and go to the final wine, the California wine. I think that most of you will probably not have had too much of a problem finding a Californian wine. Maybe in some European countries, it's not quite so easy to come by. Well, actually, I didn't even say California, did I? I said USA. So you could equally well get an Oregon example, or perhaps someone's got some from the northeast of the USA. Where does your example come from? I mean, I think naturally when people say the word Chardonnay in the USA, California is a natural thought, but I've had many great examples from Oregon recently, for sure. And we can talk about that in just a sec. Neil's got the Mathiasen, which is always a lovely wine. Anthony's got a Santa Barbara, so from a bit further south. Okay, so California and Oregon, yes. I mean, in general, in terms of international importance, those I think are your main two states. Yes, is it grown in Virginia and New York? Sure, but I think they don't quite have the same international reputation for the variety as those states on the West Coast. Oregon, I mentioned Oregon. In general terms, I'm arguing here that Oregon can be more restrained than California. Perhaps hasn't got quite the same sunny, open, opulent ripeness of fruit that California often exhibits. But that's not always true. These days, you don't have to search too far to find a 14.5% Chardonnay from Oregon. Certainly in recent vintages, it has been pretty hot there. And of course, my point that there are parts of California which are very cool. I was just reading an article in World of Fine Wine about the new AVA of not just Sonoma Coast, but the West Sonoma Coast. So really just inland from the Pacific Ocean by just a couple of miles. And that kind of region is very, very cool. I do want to make a point about that though, which is that certainly for any of us who are wine professionals, these are the wine regions and the wine styles that get written about, and they appear in wine bars in major urban centers in the US and abroad. But you know, just a word of hesitation on my part, I guess, to say that we might drink them as kind of wine geeks, but they're still very far from the commercial norm. And the great majority of wines, not only at commercial level at $15 and under, but also at more mainstream level up to $50, is still going to be a much broader, riper style. So yes, those new lower alcohol 12 to 13.5% wines with the very strong line of bracing acidity, you can find them easily enough, but I still think they're a minority sport in the US. So that's just my word of caution, I think, about that. Okay, so let's see what you guys have got. Russian River, Oregon, Mendocino, good. So Mendocino, a cooler part of California, I love that. And Carneros for Jessica. I do think the Carneros can produce quite warm styles. Fleur has got Monterey, always nice examples from there. Evening Lands for Rodolfo, restrained style. Okay, Au Bon Climat from Santa Barbara, classic example. Okay, so let's just talk here about the first of the two lower bullet points. So again, remember that the USA qualities I am talking about should apply both to white wines and to red wines. So, you know, maybe think about like a Cabernet or something when you're reading these bullet points, and then we'll see whether we can make them fit for Chardonnay too. Look, we just talked about in New Zealand and Australia, this emphasis on fruit first, fruit primacy, fruit purity. I think that the USA, especially the warmer regions in California, can really take this even further and say that we want particularly generous fruit. We love ripeness, and that can give a sensation of the fruit itself being somewhat sweet tasting. We are now at the other end of the spectrum from the French examples, where I keep on talking about dryness. This fruit here is much more sweet, and in the example of some of the white wines, even tropical. But you're looking for richness and ripeness, even I think also something which is very relevant when we're thinking about fruit in American wines is this question about texture. Texture is one of the least discussed and appreciated aspects of wine in general, but I think it's very relevant in the discussion of American wine. The texture of American wines can be very hedonistic. You're thinking about Pinot Noir in a much more full-bodied vein, of course, than many European examples, velvety and rich and plush, or Cabernet with its melting tannins and voluptuous fruit, Chardonnay, full-bodied and ripe and soft. So texture, I think the American winemaker enjoys making wines with very supple texture. And there I've written often considerable oak use. You know, in the higher end examples, oak is expensive, obviously, but oak for classic varieties like Cabernet, Chardonnay, Merlot, even Pinot Noir is quite prevalent, and the taste of oak is not considered, I think, a disadvantage in American wines. I think it's quite common. Now, again, obviously very broad brushstrokes, so let's get into that a little bit more for Chardonnay, but let's just taste the wines first. So tell me, and again, I apologize, I'm asking you to do the same thing twice. Just when you write your comments about the style of your wine, please tell me again where it's coming from, just for my reference. And you can also, if you like, compare it to, you know, the previous wines that we've had today in terms of ripeness and generosity of fruit. Or okay, so Stanislav's his wine is broad, rich, somewhat heavy, tropical, with obvious lees character. How can you detect lees, aging on the lees? I think it's that mid-palate texture, which is kind of a little bit almost soapy. It's a hard thing to describe, but it adds to the plushness and the richness of the texture right on the tongue. That's why I always feel it right on the tongue there. So for Michelle, rich, opulent, tropical fruit, elevated, warming alcohol. Yeah, and I mean, again, this goes to my point that yes, there are so many examples these days of restrained California Chardonnay, but tropical fruit, which is something that these producers want to avoid, the fresher styles, they want to avoid tropical fruit, but many Californian examples still have got tons of tropical fruit in them. And that's not right or it's wrong, but it's just an illusion on the part of wine geeks like us sometimes to imagine that somehow we're suddenly in a world of all skinny, Chablis-like wines. Excuse me, I went backwards on my slide. Okay, there we go. Corey is saying Russian River, big and round. Anthony says, my Santa Barbara does not represent like the many cooler examples from the area, but rather more like your description of traditional California Chardonnay. Heavy oak with high alcohol dominating the fruit sticks out versus the other three Chardonnays from elsewhere. Anthony's making a cheeky point here about Sauvignon Blanc from the US can be more interesting than Chardonnay, and let us not get sidetracked by that discussion. But what I would say is that if I go into restaurants down here in Florida and they have all American wine lists, which is normal, then I will often reach for a Sauvignon Blanc from America before I reach for Chardonnay, but that's a different question. Okay, Abigail, Russian River, buttery, rich, warm, toothy, Napa, big, plush, hedonistic, very ripe tropical fruit with high alcohol and a full body. Clear new oak and a sweet finish. So the sweet finish thing I want to pick up on because remembering I went from France where we were talking about a dry finish, someone said acid finish, well, and then maybe in top Burgundy examples you can find some mineral, or Chablis you find some mineral finish. Then we went to New Zealand and Australia where we found a fruity finish. And now some of you may have found a sweet finish maybe in your Australian example, but mostly we were just talking about a fruity finish. But now without even realizing it, we're suddenly talking about a sweet finish. The fruit itself has got a sweet quality here in California. So Neil is making a really interesting point. So he's got a Mathiasen wine. Mathiasen is a producer that tries to make a much more restrained style, but the fruit still comes from the floor of Napa Valley, so a very warm region. He says, even from this kind of producer, noticeably more lush than the previous 3 wines. Lush, I love that word, as if you can almost just sink your teeth into the richness of it. Definitely more alcohol, but still balanced. Good. Yeah, I do think that American wines, in spite of all this, can still be balanced, because if there's higher alcohol and lower acidity, there's still plenty of fruit, which keeps everything in check. So there can be a balance between alcohol and fruit for sure. Jessica says her Carneros tastes like pineapple. I do think for some reason the Carneros examples of Chardonnay can be particularly abundantly and obviously fruity. Kirsten says hers from Sonoma, plush, rich, lower acid, spicy, weighty, oily, high alcohol, with vanilla from the oak. Yep. So Luciana's got Oregon, and she says that texture is the key difference from the other wines we've had today. So I assume by that, Luciana, you mean that there's more texture perhaps in your Oregon wine than there was in the Australian or the New Zealand examples, with a sweet finish as well. So for Rodolfo Evening Land from, remind me, because there's more than one. Are you talking about is it Santa Barbara, or is there also a project in Oregon? Remind me which one you have. Anyway, you're saying round but ample acidity and restraint. That one's from Oregon. Yes, from Oregon, round but ample acidity and restraint with a leesy finish. Yeah, so Oregon combines the ripeness, but perhaps with a bit more natural acidity than some parts of California. I agree with that. I think that's what's really interesting about Oregon Chardonnay. A leesy finish. Often I do find that the leesy finish, that kind of almost milky or creamy finish, which is not from oak and it's not from the fruit, but from the contact with the yeast during the aging, can be quite common in American wines. What I often think about American winemaking in general is that the hand of the winemaker can be quite evident. In New Zealand would be the counterpoint, where we're going for fruit purity primacy, and somehow it's almost as if this wine makes itself. Honestly, I rarely think that with American wines, because you can taste the oak or the extraction or the lees or something. You can somehow taste the winemaking. The style of wine, this hedonistic ripe fruit, really requires some winemaking, which can always show its hand. So TJ is saying the Sonoma County, which is Lioco, which is one of the more restrained producers again, is not overly ripe or over oaked. Absolutely, I agree. That producer doesn't use that much oak, and it's got moderate acidity. So sure. So TJ is interestingly comparing his restrained example of Sonoma Chardonnay to Adelaide Hills. And that to me makes perfect sense. I see the stylistic comparison immediately. So what we're dealing with here is ripe fruit, but not overripe, and certainly not hedonistic, but just ripe, supple fruit with a line of acidity right through the middle of it. Monterey, sweet finish, but that could come from the oak fleur notes. It could come from the oak rather than just the fruit. Absolutely, I agree. Oak, of course, new oak especially will impart a sweet tasting sensation. Vidia, buttery, gold, deeper gold color than the other wines. That's a good point. We haven't talked about color. Sometimes California wines, especially if they've had extended time in oak, can be a deeper color. A full body, high alcohol and ripe fruit. Now, probably most of you, in terms of body, you may have had a full-bodied wine in the Australian example. You probably didn't in the New Zealand. And only if you're in somewhere like Mâcon or Puy-Frisé in France would you have had full-bodied, and maybe not even then. So this could be the first occasion today when you've had a full-bodied wine. And for a wine like TJ's from a restrained producer from Sonoma, then no. But for many of you, you will have a full-bodied Chardonnay here. So I think that's a good point. Vidya says the acidity, is medium high. Yeah, so you can still get some nice acidity in American examples for sure. Okay, so I just wrote here at the bottom the Chardonnay qualities. New oak. Again, I think we are reining back on the new oak in this country, in California and Oregon. I think the imprint of new oak is sort of fading from fashion. People don't enjoy it so much. but there are still many, many examples that are generous with their use of oak, shall we say. In lower end examples, of course, it may not be barriques, it may be chips or other flavoring. Lees stirring for texture. A lot of you have commented on the kind of creamy, leesy sensation, either in the mid palate felt on the tongue or on the finish. And I've just noted here the increasing attempts to retain acidity and precision. So we have had a lot of talk here about ripeness and hedonism and full body and oiliness and things like that. But I do think even aside from those skinny Chardonnay examples that some of you guys have, there is an overall trend in this country to make slightly more fresh wines, even from the big regions. So I think that's certainly, to my mind, that's a good move. Okay, so TJ is asking what you do if you're not sure whether it's Australian or American. Now, in TJ's example, where he was struggling between identifying between the restrained Sonoma style and a kind of restrained Adelaide Hill style from Australia, I would be, what I would naturally think is that style more likely to come from Australia or more likely to come from the USA? And I think that this style is more common still in Australia than it is in the US, where it's somewhat new. And like I said, a rather small part of the market. So I would just play the numbers. And I would think that a wine like that from Adelaide Hills is not unusual, whereas I would say a wine like that from California is unusual. So I would probably in that case go with the Australian example. Medium bodied, firm acid structure, line of acidity, maybe just a restrained use of oak, maybe just a hint of dry minerality on the finish. I think I'd probably go with Australia. Okay, so let me just see whether we can just sum up here. So the way I sort of wanted to order the wines in this session was, I think, reasonably obvious. I kind of going from less ripe, cooler climate to riper still. And I think it's quite instructive, isn't it? It's quite interesting. I particularly am interested by the transition from fruit not really being the focus in French examples. Like Chablis, obviously, I would say that the minerality, saltiness, the chalkiness, if you're a Chablis producer, may be more important than, oh, I've got plenty of lemon and green apple flavors in my wine. Great. I don't really think that the fruit is the point of Chablis. And the same might extend to producers in the Côte d'Or, in Pouligny-Montrachet or Chassagne-en-Marceau. And so the other elements of the wine that contribute to the complexity, the minerality, and the dry finish may be really the focal points of those wines and not the fruit. Maybe a little bit more in Macon, sure, and further south, but still what holds those wines in tensions, and the best examples of Macon and Puy-Fusset and Saint-Véran, places like that, is a sort of underlying dryness, whether you call that just a dry finish or whether you call it minerality. There's something which offsets the ripe fruit. Then you go to New Zealand, where the fruit is very clearly the focal point, but it's so vibrant and bright and full of life. It's just very clear, it's transparent. Then you go to Australia, where it's riper again, but not heavy. And then you go to the US, where it's ripe to very ripe, and even hedonistic, and even perhaps in some examples on the verge of being too much. It can be almost sweet tasting. So I think that's an interesting transition. Again, I caution you about taking anything away from this session being like, oh, Adelaide Hills is like X and Margaret River is like Y. But I do think that it's possible on the basis of climate between the different countries. We can say in general Australia is warmer than New Zealand to make some overall statements for sure. And then I think a lot of the differences between these regions within, say, Australia or within New Zealand are almost about individual winemakers or winemaking choices within a certain region. In places like New Zealand, we're literally watching a country develop its understanding of its own terroir. So I think it's kind of probably foolhardy on our part to say, oh, well, this is what Central Otago tastes like, this is what Marlborough tastes like. I mean, this is still a very young project. So I'm a little bit tentative about that. But climate is still really an important guide for me. California is simply warmer than these cooler parts of Australia. Even the cooler parts of Australia are warmer than most parts of New Zealand. And New Zealand, with fantastic sunlight, gets more wonderful sun than a large parts of France do. So that may also account for the difference in styles. So that's why I love climate so much. I think it's one of those things which is very difficult to manipulate. Country-specific winemaking styles. I mean, to me, actually, just having done this, it makes me think more than ever that we can make statements with more confidence about winemaking styles across a whole country. I'm much more relaxed about doing that, about saying Australia, for instance, is ripe but balanced, than I am about saying Margaret River is this and Yarra Valley is that. But I think on country level, I can be a lot more confident and relaxed. And then that's why I put regional characteristics at the end here, because after you've got your country observations down, that's when you can hone in a little bit more on the regional aspects. But I do think that my takeaway probably from doing this is the importance of having a kind of shorthand country by country. And what's going to change in the future sessions is that we're actually going to, in some of the sessions, not all of them, we're going to look at regions instead of just whole countries. So that's going to be kind of interesting as well. Any final questions before you wrap up here? Otherwise, we will move on. Next week, I thought rather than just doing white, 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 red, 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 we'd alternate. So just for fun. So next week, we're going to do Cabernet. So I think that's a fantastic place to start. It's totally different styles across the world. You guys can see the wine list, of course, online. Stanislav is asking, what's the common denominator for all these Chardonnays, the varietal commonality? I mean, I think, we're talking about a variety which is moderately aromatic, but that's not the focus. The focus is on a generous fruitiness, but balanced by acidity, with the potential, nonetheless, in spite of the fruit, to be dry and fresh on the finish. Chardonnay, I think, to my mind, should always be balanced, always easy to drink, always give pleasure, but have the great potential for complexity there. Okay, guys, I will leave you, and I will see you back at the same time next week. You will receive the link to the recording of this session within 1 hour from now. Thank you, guys, and see you next week.